Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Bernie Sanders never became president. He never even became the Democratic nominee. Yet it's possible that no politician of the last decade has changed the Democratic Party more than Bernie Sanders. That sounds strange at first. In American politics, we usually assume that the winners make history. Ronald Reagan won. Barack Obama won. Donald Trump won. Their victories reshaped their parties and, in many ways, the country itself. But Sanders may be one of those rare politicians who lost the big prize while still winning the larger argument. Think back to the Democratic Party before 2016. The party of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton was certainly liberal by American standards, but it was also comfortable with capitalism. Democrats talked about expanding healthcare, increasing opportunities, and creating economic growth. They criticized inequality, but they generally believed that the existing system could be reformed through gradual change. Bernie Sanders came along and asked a much more fundamental question. What if the problem wasn't simply that the system needed adjustments? What if the system itself was failing millions of Americans? That message hit American politics like a thunderbolt. Remember, Sanders didn't emerge during a time of national prosperity and optimism. He emerged after the Great Recession. Millions of Americans had watched Wall Street crash the economy and then receive government bailouts. They saw housing prices recover while many working families never fully did. They saw college tuition explode, healthcare costs continue to rise, and younger Americans struggle to achieve the same standard of living their parents enjoyed. For many Americans, especially younger voters, the traditional promise of the American dream no longer seemed guaranteed. And Bernie Sanders gave voice to that frustration. He talked about billionaires and millionaires controlling the political system. He attacked corporate power. He argued that healthcare should be a right, not a privilege. He called for stronger unions, free public college, and major redistributive policies. You don't have to agree with every one of his proposals to recognize what happened next. Ideas that once sat on the political fringe suddenly moved toward the center of Democratic politics. Medicare for all became a serious national debate. Student debt cancellation became mainstream. Calls for taxing the wealthy gained enormous support among Democratic voters. Discussions about inequality became central to almost every major policy debate inside the party. Even politicians who never considered themselves democratic socialists began adopting parts of Sanders' language. That's why I think one of the most important things to understand about Sanders is this. He didn't necessarily win elections, but he won agenda-setting power. The Democratic Party today often debates questions that Sanders forced onto the national stage. Now, this is where both supporters and critics sometimes exaggerate. Some conservatives argue that Sanders turned the Democratic Party into a socialist party. I don't think that's entirely accurate. The Democratic Party remains a coalition. There are progressive activists and lawmakers who share many of Sanders' ideas, but there are also moderate Democrats from swing states who remain much more centrist. Governors and senators from states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada often sound very different from progressive members of Congress from deep blue districts. President Joe Biden himself never described himself as a socialist. Gavin Newsom isn't a socialist. Many Democratic officials still accept market capitalism and prefer reform over radical restructuring. So no, I don't think America suddenly has a major socialist party in the European sense. But I do think the party's center of gravity has moved left on economic issues. That's an important distinction. In many ways, Sanders changed the questions Democrats ask. Before Sanders, the question was often, how can we improve the system? After Sanders, the question increasingly became, is the system fundamentally serving ordinary Americans at all? That shift in attitude may be his greatest legacy. And I would argue that Sanders changed something even deeper than policy debates. He changed the emotional tone of the Democratic Party. Under Barack Obama, the dominant message was essentially this: America has problems, but our institutions work. Progress is possible. The future can be better. Sanders offered a more pessimistic diagnosis. He suggested that economic and political institutions had become captured by wealthy interests. He argued that inequality wasn't simply an unfortunate byproduct of capitalism, but evidence of a system that increasingly benefited the few at the expense of the many. That message resonated because millions of Americans already felt it. Look at the numbers. Home prices have risen dramatically, college costs have skyrocketed, healthcare expenses remain extraordinarily high. Younger generations often report less confidence that they will enjoy a higher standard of living than their parents. Many Americans don't necessarily identify as socialists, but they do feel that something in the system is broken. And that feeling matters enormously, because politics is often driven less by ideology than by emotion. People support political movements because those movements explain their frustrations and offer a sense of meaning. Sanders explained economic anxiety through the lens of inequality and concentrated wealth. Donald Trump explained many of the same frustrations through the lens of globalization, elite institutions, immigration, and cultural displacement. This brings us to something fascinating. At first glance, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders look like political opposites. In many respects, they are. They disagree on taxes, healthcare, climate policy, immigration, and the role of government. But they also share something important. Both are products of the same historical moment. Both emerged from widespread dissatisfaction with the post-Cold War consensus. For decades, both parties largely embraced globalization, free trade, expanding international integration, and an increasingly financialized economy. Those policies generated enormous wealth, but they also created winners and losers. Entire communities felt left behind. Manufacturing jobs disappeared in some regions. Housing became less affordable. Economic insecurity increased for many families. Millions of Americans concluded that the people running the country no longer understood their lives. Trump and Sanders simply offered different explanations. Trump said the system was failing because of globalist elites, bad trade deals, and an unresponsive establishment. Sanders said the system was failing because of corporate power, billionaire influence, and extreme inequality. Different diagnoses, different prescriptions, but they were speaking to many of the same emotions. That's why both movements generated such passionate support. Both represented a rejection of business as usual. And I think that's one of the biggest stories of modern American politics. The old political center weakened. The public became more polarized. And voters increasingly looked for leaders who promised not simply to manage the system, but to challenge it. This also explains why American politics feels increasingly emotional and ideological. People aren't merely arguing about tax rates anymore. They're arguing about whether the system itself deserves trust. And once politics reaches that stage, compromise becomes much harder. Now let's talk about the future. I actually don't think the biggest challenge facing Democrats is that they moved left. Political parties evolve all the time. The bigger challenge is turning progressive ideas into policies that can win durable national majorities. This is where things become complicated. Many progressive ideas poll very well in theory. People like the idea of universal health care. People like the idea of reducing inequality. People like the idea of making college more affordable. But support often becomes softer when voters hear about costs, taxes, or practical implementation. Similarly, some progressive slogans that energized activists created backlash among moderate and independent voters. National elections require broad coalitions. Winning on social media is not the same as winning swing states. This is one reason Sanders never became the Democratic nominee, despite his enormous influence. His movement was passionate, energized, and highly effective at shaping debate. But building a majority coalition in America requires persuading many voters who are less ideological and often more cautious. Still, none of this should diminish Sanders' historical importance. When historians look back on this era, I think they may reach a surprising conclusion. Ronald Reagan redefined conservatism around free markets and limited government. Donald Trump redefined the Republican Party around populism, nationalism, and cultural politics. And Bernie Sanders redefined how Democrats think about economic fairness and the relationship between markets and government. He persuaded millions of Americans that inequality isn't simply a side issue, it's one of the central political questions of our time. He convinced an entire generation of younger voters that government should play a larger role in addressing economic insecurity. And perhaps most importantly, he changed the way Americans talk about the economy itself. Because before Bernie Sanders, inequality was often treated as one issue among many. After Bernie Sanders, inequality became the lens through which millions of Democrats interpret almost everything else. And whether you consider that development inspiring or troubling, one thing seems undeniable. Bernie Sanders may never have occupied the Oval Office. But, in many ways, he already changed the Democratic Party and perhaps American politics itself. Thanks for watching.